June 3, 1942 dawned with deceptive calm across the Central Pacific, though Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's combined fleet carried the weight of empire on its steel decks. The architect of Pearl Harbor stood aboard the super battleship, Yamato, 300 miles behind his striking force, convinced that destiny sailed with Japan's carriers toward a tiny atoll called Midway. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo commanded the Kido Butai, the sword strike of 4 fleet carriers that had terrorized Allied positions from Hawaii to Ceylon, and confidence radiated through every compartment of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu like the rising sun itself. The Japanese command structure appeared impeccable on organizational charts drafted in Tokyo's Navy Ministry. Yamamoto held supreme authority, Nagamo controlled carrier operations, and Rear Admiral Yamaguchi commanded Carrier Division 2 with fierce competence. Communication protocols followed rigid hierarchical patterns perfected through decades of naval tradition. Orders flowed downward through clearly defined channels, and subordinates executed commands without question. This pyramid of authority had conquered half the Pacific in 6 months, making Japan's navy seem invincible to observers in Washington and London. According to Samuel Eliot Morrison's authoritative 15-volume history of United States naval operations in World War II, published between 1947 and 1962, the Japanese planners believed their command superiority would overwhelm American defenders through sheer coordination and discipline. Yet invisible fractures already weakened this structure. Yamamoto's battle plans suffered from dangerous complexity, dividing his forces across thousands of square miles of ocean. The Aleutian invasion force sailed north as a diversion, the Midway. Invasion transports approached from the southwest. Nagamo's carriers struck from the northwest, and Yamamoto's battleships lingered far behind, too distant to support anyone in crisis. No single commander grasped the complete operational picture. Radio silence prevented coordination between separated elements, transforming unified command into isolated fragments making independent decisions. The intelligence failure compounded these structural weaknesses. Japanese naval intelligence convinced Yamamoto that American carriers remained near Hawaii, still recovering from coral sea damage. Captain Joseph Rochefort's cryptanalysis team at Pearl Harbor had shattered Japanese naval codes weeks earlier, but Tokyo's overconfidence prevented them from considering compromise. Nagamo sailed toward Midway, believing surprise belonged to Japan, unaware that Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's task forces 16 and 17 already lurked northeast of the atoll, positioned perfectly to ambush the ambushers. Communication technology imposed further limitations on Japanese command effectiveness. American forces employed radar and sophisticated radio networks that permitted rapid information sharing across task forces. Japanese carriers relied primarily on visual signals and limited radio communication hampered by strict protocols. Nagamo could not easily coordinate with Yamaguchi's division or request guidance from Yamamoto without breaking radio silence and revealing fleet positions. This communication gap meant each commander operated semi-independently, making critical decisions based on incomplete battlefield awareness. The cultural dimensions of Japanese naval hierarchy created perhaps the most dangerous weakness. Junior officers hesitated to contradict superiors or deliver unwelcome intelligence. Innovation and initiative received less encouragement than obedience and adherence to established doctrine. When circumstances demanded flexibility and rapid adaptation, this rigid command culture would prove catastrophic. The stage was set for structural collapse under combat pressure that would test every assumption underlying Japanese naval supremacy. June 4th arrived with Nagamo's carriers launching their initial strike against Midway's installations at 4:30 in the morning. 108 aircraft roared from flight decks toward the atoll while combat air patrol fighters circled protectively above the fleet. Commander Mitsuo Fukita, who led the Pearl Harbor attack, remained aboard Akagi recovering from appendicitis, watching anxiously as Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga guided the strike force westward through pre-dawn darkness. The carriers turned into the wind for launch operations, then recovered course, awaiting reports from the attacking squadrons. The command structure's first significant failure emerged during this opening phase. Nagamo launched search planes to scan the ocean sectors where American carriers might lurk, but inadequate resources and poor execution undermined this critical reconnaissance. Several search planes launched late due to catapult malfunctions. The cruiser Tone's No. 4 float plane departed 30 minutes behind schedule, a delay that would prove catastrophic. Search patterns left dangerous gaps in coverage, and pilots received instructions to fly outbound legs, then return, lacking orders to expand searches if they spotted enemy forces. At 7 o'clock, Tominaga radioed that Midway required a second strike to suppress its defenses adequately. This message confronted Nagamo with his first major decision crisis. Half his aircraft remained on deck armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for potential naval engagement, the proper loadout for attacking American carriers. Tominaga's request suggested switching these weapons to high-explosive bombs suitable for land targets. Nagamo consulted with his staff officer, Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical planner who had refined the Pearl Harbor attack plan. Genda supported rearming for a second Midway strike since reconnaissance reported no American ships nearby. At 7:15, Nagamo issued the fateful order: rearm aircraft for land attack. Ordnance crews swarmed over the strike aircraft, parked on hangar decks below, removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, rolling them aside and hauling up high-explosive bombs and incendiary weapons from magazines. This complex operation required time and created chaos on the hangar decks, with deadly munitions lying unsecured throughout the workspace. Fuel hoses snaked between aircraft as mechanics topped off tanks for the projected second wave. Then at 7:45, the communication that shattered Japanese confidence crackled through radio speakers. Tone's tardy search plane finally reported sighting 10 American ships. The message provided direction and distance but omitted the critical information Nagamo desperately needed: ship types. Were these carriers or merely cruisers and destroyers? The scout pilot failed to clarify, either from poor training or communication difficulties. Nagamo immediately radioed back demanding ship identification, but precious minutes evaporated awaiting response. This moment exposed the command structure's brittleness under pressure. Nagamo faced multiple simultaneous crises without clear guidance from superior authority. American planes from Midway attacked his carriers in uncoordinated waves, ineffective, but forcing defensive maneuvers and occupying his combat air patrol. His returning Midway strike force orbited overhead, low on fuel, demanding immediate recovery. Half his reserve aircraft sat on hangar decks surrounded by bombs and fuel in the midst of rearming operations. And somewhere beyond the horizon, American ships of unknown type potentially threatened his carriers, the rigid Japanese. Command hierarchy provided no mechanism for rapid adaptation. Nagamo could not easily consult Yamamoto 300 miles distant. He could not delegate decisions to his carrier captains, who awaited orders according to established protocol. Junior officers hesitated to offer unsolicited advice to the vice admiral. The same authoritarian structure that enabled efficient execution of predetermined plans now paralyzed initiative when circumstances demanded immediate, flexible response to fluid battlefield conditions, developing faster than the command hierarchy could process information. The minutes between 8 and 9 o'clock on June 4th tested every assumption underlying Japanese naval command philosophy. Tone Scout finally reported at 8 o'clock that the enemy formation included what appeared to be a carrier, though uncertainty plagued even this delayed intelligence. Nagamo's staff exploded into urgent discussion aboard Akagi's flag bridge. Commander Genda advocated immediate attack with whatever forces stood ready, even if improperly armed with land bombs. Others counseled waiting to properly rearm with anti-ship weapons. The decision paralysis reflected deeper structural problems. No doctrine existed for this exact scenario, and rigid hierarchy prevented subordinates from seizing initiative. Nagamo chose compromise, satisfying no one. He ordered aircraft rearmed, again with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, reversing the earlier command. Ordnance crews now reversed their work, removing land bombs just loaded and retrieving the anti-ship weapons previously stowed. The hangar decks descended into organized chaos. Meanwhile, returning Midway strike aircraft circled desperately above the fleet, fuel gauges approaching empty. At 9:18, Nagamo prioritized recovering these aircraft, clearing flight decks that had been spotted with the partially rearmed strike force. This decision seemed operationally sound but contained fatal consequences. Aircraft moved back, down to already crowded hangar decks to complete rearming operations below. Torpedoes, bombs of various types, fuel hoses, tools, and ammunition cluttered the confined spaces. Safety protocols demanded securing munitions properly and removing fuel before working around ordnance, but time pressure forced dangerous shortcuts. Officers throughout the carrier force recognized the mounting risks yet felt powerless to challenge command decisions or modify procedures without explicit authorization. The American carrier strike forces approached undetected during this vulnerable window. 3 separate formations from Enterprise and Hornet searched for the Japanese fleet, navigating by calculated estimates of enemy position. Communication between American squadrons proved nearly as problematic as Japanese coordination difficulties. Squadron commanders made independent decisions about search patterns and attack timing, sometimes working at cross purposes. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 on a course diverging from his carrier's other squadrons, following intuition rather than orders, initiative unthinkable in the Japanese command culture. At 9:20, lookouts aboard Akagi spotted aircraft approaching low over the ocean from the southeast. Torpedo Squadron 8 had found Nagamo's carriers. 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers pressed their attack without fighter escort or dive bomber support, flying obsolete aircraft against modern Japanese defenders. 0 fighters from the combat air patrol dove on the American torpedo planes like hawks striking sparrows. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black bursts and tracer streams. Within minutes, Japanese fighters and gunners slaughtered all 15 American aircraft. Not one torpedo struck Japanese ships. Every crew member perished except Ensign George Gay, who survived his crash and floated among the enemy fleet. Watching subsequent events from the water. Victory seemed complete. Japanese sailors cheered as burning American aircraft splashed into the Pacific. The command structure appeared vindicated. Nagamo's carriers had weathered the attack without damage, and now his own strike force neared readiness to launch a devastating counterattack against the American carriers. At 9:30, more American torpedo bombers appeared. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 attacking from a different direction. Again, 0 fighters and anti-aircraft guns eviscerated the attackers. 10 of 14 aircraft crashed, burning into the ocean. Minutes later, Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 arrived, losing 10 of 12 aircraft to the ferocious Japanese defense. The Japanese command structure interpreted these one-sided victories as confirmation of tactical superiority. What Nagamo and his staff failed to recognize was how the torpedo attacks had drawn their defenses downward and inward. Combat Air Patrol fighters orbited at low altitude, having just destroyed 3 torpedo squadrons. The carriers maneuvered independently, breaking formation during evasive action. Anti-aircraft crews tracked low-flying targets, their guns elevated only slightly above the horizon. Officers focused on immediate threats, watching for more torpedo bombers. And, critically, the command hierarchy provided no mechanism for picket ships or scout planes to alert the carriers about a more deadly threat diving from 20,000 feet directly overhead. 10-20-2 on June 4 marked the moment Japanese naval command structure collapsed beyond recovery. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey led 33 Douglas SBD dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise through broken clouds at high altitude, having searched desperately for Nagamo's carriers after finding empty ocean at the calculated intercept point. Low fuel gauges threatened to force the squadron back to Enterprise without engaging, but McCluskey spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northward and gambled that she steamed toward the main fleet. His intuition proved correct. The Enterprise squadrons arrived simultaneously with 17 Dauntless bombers from Yorktown led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie. Pure chance brought 50 American dive bombers over the Japanese carriers at precisely the moment their defenses focused entirely on low-altitude threats. Nagumo's command structure, designed for hierarchical control and coordinated response, simply lacked mechanisms for distributing threat information rapidly enough to meet this crisis. Individual ship commanders could not redirect combat air patrol fighters orbiting at sea level. Carrier captains awaited orders from Nagumo rather than taking independent defensive action. McCluskey's squadrons rolled into dives at Kaga and Akagi while Leslie's bombers plummeted toward Soryu. The Japanese carriers represented perfect targets, flight decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed, hangar decks packed with munitions and fuel hoses, crews focused on preparing the strike rather than defending the ships. Anti-aircraft. Gunners swung their weapons skyward but lacked time to establish effective fire. The command paralysis that gripped Nagumo's staff now infected every level of the fleet hierarchy. Individual captains hesitated to order emergency maneuvers without clearance. Damage control teams awaited direction from superiors rather than initiating preparations independently. At 10:24, a 1,000-pound bomb from Lieutenant Richard Best's Dauntless struck Akagi near the midships elevator. The explosion detonated munitions on the hangar deck in a catastrophic chain reaction. Aviation fuel from ruptured hoses fed roaring flames through confined spaces packed with armed aircraft and loose ordnance. A second bomb smashed through the flight deck near the port stern gun mount, creating additional fires. Within minutes, Akagi transformed from proud flagship to blazing wreck, her command spaces choked with smoke, communication systems wrecked, and fire control capabilities destroyed. Kaga absorbed 4 direct hits within minutes, bombs plunging through wooden flight decks into hangar spaces prepared like powder magazines for catastrophe. Massive explosions ripped through the carrier's vitals. Soryu took 3 hits that similarly ignited uncontrollable infernos. 3 fleet carriers, the core of Japanese striking power, became floating pyres in 6 minutes. The mathematical precision of dive bombing had exploited every vulnerability created by command decisions, made under pressure without adequate information or flexible doctrine. The command structure's dissolution accelerated geometrically. Nagumo's staff abandoned Akagi's smoke-filled flag spaces, the admiral climbing down ropes into a small boat to transfer flag operations to the light cruiser Nagara. This physical relocation severed communication with surviving forces during the battle's critical phase. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu, the only surviving fleet carrier, suddenly became the senior operational commander present, yet possessed no clear picture of overall fleet disposition or Yamamoto's intentions. The hierarchical system that demanded clear vertical authority had lost its apex, and subordinate commanders lacked cultural conditioning or doctrinal guidance for assuming initiative. Yamaguchi demonstrated the decisive leadership the rigid command structure normally suppressed. Without waiting for direction from Nagumo or permission from Yamamoto, he ordered immediate strikes against the American carriers with whatever forces Hiryu possessed. At 10:40, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched toward the reported American position. This aggressive response represented exactly the flexibility Japanese command culture typically discouraged junior commanders making independent, strategic decisions without authorization from superiors. That Yamaguchi felt compelled to act without orders revealed how completely the normal structure had failed. Yamaguchi's independent action highlighted the command vacuum spreading through the Japanese fleet like the fires consuming Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Aboard Yamato, 300 miles from the devastation, Admiral Yamamoto received fragmented reports suggesting disaster but lacking detailed information about carrier losses or current tactical situations. The rigid radio discipline that served Japanese forces during offensive operations now prevented rapid assessment and response to catastrophe. Yamamoto's staff struggled to reconstruct battlefield conditions from incomplete messages, unable to provide timely guidance to surviving forces facing immediate crises. Hiryu's strike force found Yorktown at noon and pressed a determined attack despite heavy fighter opposition. 3 bombs struck the American carrier, causing serious damage and forcing her crew to abandon ship temporarily. This success seemed to vindicate Yamaguchi's initiative, but the victory proved hollow. American damage control parties reported Yorktown and began salvage operations while Enterprise and Hornet remained untouched, preparing additional strikes. The Japanese command structure lacked mechanisms for accurately assessing. American carrier strength intelligence officers had variously estimated 1, 2, or 3 enemy carriers present, and Yamaguchi's pilots returned claiming they had struck the only American carrier in the area. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Hiryu launched her second and final Strike 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters, representing her last offensive capability. These aircraft found Yorktown again, now underway after repairs, and scored 2 torpedo hits that finally forced permanent abandonment. But the strike cost Japan dearly. Only 5 aircraft returned to Hiryu, and those crews brought news of at least 2 more American carriers operating nearby. The mathematical calculus became inescapable. Hiryu stood alone against multiple enemy carriers with her strike capability exhausted and her deck crowded with returning aircraft, requiring fuel and armament. Enterprise launched the counterstrike at 3:30. 24 dive bombers found Hiryu at 5 o'clock and delivered 4 devastating bomb hits. Fire spread through the carrier following the same catastrophic pattern that doomed her sister's munitions detonating, fuel feeding flames, damage control overwhelmed by cascading destruction. Yamaguchi radioed Yamamoto requesting permission to remain aboard his flagship, choosing death over survival. The message reflected samurai values embedded in Japanese naval culture, but it also eliminated the one Japanese commander who had demonstrated flexibility and initiative during the crisis. Yamamoto finally reached command decisions late on June 4th, but distance and communication delays meant his orders arrived too late to influence outcomes. He commanded the scattered fleet elements to converge for a surface engagement, hoping battleship firepower might redeem the carrier disaster. This directive reflected outdated tactical thinking. The Battle of Midway had already proven carrier aviation's supremacy over surface gunnery. More critically, Yamamoto's orders demonstrated how the hierarchical structure produced strategic paralysis. Rather than trusting surviving commanders to make appropriate tactical decisions, the system demanded that distant supreme authority direct operations. He could neither observe nor adequately control. The institutional command failures extended beyond tactical decisions to fundamental strategic planning. The Midway operation had dispersed Japanese forces too widely for mutual support, violated the principle of concentration of force, and gambled everything on surprise that competent American intelligence had negated. These flaws reflected command culture that discouraged subordinates from challenging superior officers' plans, even when obvious weaknesses existed. Multiple staff officers in Tokyo and aboard Yamato had privately questioned the operation's complexity, but hierarchical protocols prevented them from effectively voicing concerns. By midnight, Yamamoto accepted reality and ordered general withdrawal. This decision came only after Commander Yahachi Tanabe's submarine 1-168 reported torpedoing Yorktown intelligence that convinced Yamamoto that Japan had sunk 2 American carriers while losing 4 fleet carriers herself. Even this assessment proved optimistic. Yorktown would not sink until June 7th, and Enterprise and Hornet escaped unscathed. The command structure's information failures persisted through the battle's final hours, with supreme leadership making strategic decisions based on incomplete and inaccurate battlefield intelligence. The retreat itself exposed continuing command dysfunction. Fleet elements scattered across hundreds of miles received conflicting orders as plans changed repeatedly. The cruiser force assigned to bombard Midway blundered forward in darkness, colliding with each other when evasive maneuvers attempted to avoid an American submarine. Mogami and Mikuma crashed together, with Mikuma taking severe damage that would prove fatal when American dive bombers found the crippled cruisers on June 6th. Even withdrawal, the simplest military operation, exceeded the degraded command structure's capacity for coordinated execution. June 5th dawned over a Pacific Ocean littered with burning wrecks and Japanese defeat, though the full magnitude of disaster remained unclear to Tokyo's naval general staff. 3 fleet carriers had sunk during the night. Kaga, Soryu, and Akagi, the latter scuttled by torpedoes from Japanese destroyers after fire made her unsalvageable. Here Yu remained afloat but burning uncontrollably, flames consuming the ship from within while Rear Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Tomio Kaku stayed aboard, choosing death as their carrier settled beneath the waves at 9 o'clock in the morning. 4 fleet carriers destroyed represented half of Japan's first-line carrier strength, along with irreplaceable aircrew, whose training required years. The command structure's collapse continued during the retreat. American submarines and aircraft harassed withdrawing Japanese forces, inflicting additional losses the compromised command hierarchy struggled to minimize. Mikuma sank under repeated dive bomber attacks on June 6, validation that American carrier aviation maintained offensive capability while Japanese forces fled. The scattered fleet elements reunited slowly, communication confusion delaying rendezvous and leaving isolated ships vulnerable. Yamamoto's staff attempted to reassert centralized control, but the mechanisms for rapid information sharing and coordinated response had proven inadequate during crisis. Perhaps the most significant command failure manifested in Tokyo's response to defeat. Naval authorities suppressed accurate casualty reports and minimized the disaster's scope in reports to Imperial General Headquarters and Emperor Hirohito. This institutional dishonesty reflected cultural imperatives within Japanese military hierarchy that punished bearers of bad news and rewarded optimistic assessments regardless of accuracy. Officers who survived Midway faced interrogations that emphasized blame assignment rather than lessons learned. Junior officers hesitated to provide frank assessments of command. Failures to senior admirals whose decisions had created catastrophe. The rigid hierarchy that had characterized Japanese naval command before Midway calcified further rather than adapting to revealed deficiencies. Captain Mitsuo Fukita, recovering from appendicitis throughout the battle, later attempted to document lessons learned and tactical failures in honest after-action analysis. His superiors suppressed or altered his reports to protect reputations of senior commanders. The culture that prevented subordinates from questioning flawed plans before Midway now prevented institutional learning from defeat. Analysis of American tactical advantages in communication, damage control, and flexible command doctrine received minimal attention. Strategic consequences of the command collapse at Midway rippled through subsequent Pacific War operations. Japan's combined fleet never regained offensive initiative lost during those 4 catastrophic days. American forces seized strategic advantage and retained it through increasingly effective command structures that emphasized initiative, decentralized authority, and rapid information distribution. The hierarchical rigidity that handicapped Japanese operations at Midway persisted throughout the war, contributing to defeats at Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf. Personnel losses among Japanese carrier aviation proved even more devastating than ship losses. Approximately 320 aircrew perished at Midway, and Japan's training infrastructure lacked capacity to replace them adequately. American naval aviation training produced replacement pilots by the thousands, while Japanese programs maintained quality at the expense of quantity. The command decisions that concentrated Japan's most experienced carrier pilots at Midway without adequate reserves reflected the same centralized control mentality that failed during the battle itself. Supreme authority hoarding elite resources rather than distributing capability. Throughout the fleet, the rigid command structure also inhibited Japan's carrier construction and aviation expansion programs after Midway. Rather than fundamentally reorganizing carrier operations to emphasize flexibility and distributed command, Japanese naval leadership attempted to rebuild carrier forces following the same organizational models that had failed at Midway. New carrier divisions formed with the same hierarchical control mechanisms, the same communication limitations, and the same cultural barriers to junior officer initiative. American naval forces evolved continuously throughout the war, incorporating lessons from each engagement into doctrine and organization. Japanese forces repeated the same structural mistakes with predictable results. The command structure failure at Midway fundamentally altered the Pacific War's trajectory in ways that extended far beyond immediate tactical defeat. Japan entered June 4, 1942, as the Pacific's dominant naval power, possessing initiative, operational experience, and technological parity with American forces. By June 7th, that dominance had evaporated, replaced by strategic defensive posture from which Japan never recovered. The transformation occurred not merely because American bombs destroyed 4 carriers, but because the rigid hierarchical command system that had enabled Japan's initial conquest proved catastrophically inadequate when faced with operational complexity and battlefield uncertainty, historians analyzing Midway have identified multiple tactical failures: inadequate reconnaissance, poor intelligence assessment, unfortunate timing, and material vulnerabilities of armored flight decks with munitions and fuel exposed. Yet the underlying cause of all these failures was structural: a command hierarchy that concentrated authority at the apex while suppressing initiative below, that prioritized obedience over adaptation, and that lacked mechanisms for rapid information distribution and coordinated response to fluid battlefield conditions. The same organizational characteristics that enabled efficient execution of predetermined plans paralyzed response when circumstances deviated from expectations. American naval command structure, while imperfect, demonstrated critical advantages that Midway highlighted starkly. American commanders from squadron to task force level exercised initiative within commander's intent, making independent tactical decisions without waiting for authorization from distant superiors. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's decision to extend his search rather than return to Enterprise when failing to find Japanese carriers at expected positions exemplified initiative unthinkable in Japanese command culture. This flexibility allowed American forces to exploit opportunities as they emerged rather than executing rigid predetermined plans. Regardless of changed circumstances, the communication technology gap, mentioned in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive naval history, amplified structural differences. American task forces employed radio networks that permitted rapid information sharing between widely separated units while maintaining appropriate radio discipline. Japanese forces relied on more restrictive communications that prioritized security over coordination, leaving commanders isolated and unable to develop common operational pictures. When rapid adaptation became essential, American structures enabled it while Japanese structures prevented it. Cultural factors embedded in both command structures proved equally decisive as technological or doctrinal differences. American naval culture, inherited from British traditions and American democratic values, accepted questioning of authority and encouraged innovation from junior officers. Japanese naval culture, rooted in samurai traditions and reinforced by decades of authoritarian government, demanded unquestioning obedience and punished deviation from established protocols. These cultural foundations meant that even when individual Japanese officers recognized better tactical options during Midway's crisis, they lacked authorization to implement them or even suggest them forcefully to superiors. The Battle of Midway's legacy extended through subsequent decades of military analysis and command structure evolution. Modern naval doctrine emphasizes distributed command, rapid information sharing through network systems, and initiative at all levels principles validated by American success and Japanese failure at Midway. The rigid hierarchical model that served 19th-century naval warfare proved obsolete in the fast-paced, information-intensive environment of modern combat. Japan's command structure represented an evolutionary dead end, while American flexibility pointed toward future development. For Japan, Midway's command failures foreshadowed defeat. The institutional inability to learn from disaster, the cultural barriers to honest assessment, and the continued reliance on rigid hierarchy ensured that subsequent battles repeated Midway's patterns. Japanese carriers at the Philippine Sea in 1944 suffered similar catastrophic losses when their command structure again failed to adapt to American tactical innovation. The hierarchical model that crumbled under Midway's firestorm never successfully rebuilt, and Japan's Navy limped toward final defeat with the same structural weaknesses unaddressed, the ultimate lesson from Japanese Command collapse at Midway transcends naval warfare or even military affairs. Any hierarchical organization facing complex, rapidly evolving challenges must balance centralized control with distributed initiative, must reward accuracy over optimism in information flow, and must cultivate cultural acceptance of adaptation and learning from failure. Japan's rigid command structure achieved impressive results when circumstances aligned with predetermined plans but catastrophically failed when reality demanded flexibility. That failure cost 4 carriers on June 4th and ultimately cost Japan the Pacific War itself.